Good morning. Welcome to the guest speaker series for the Intentional Optimist Unconventional Leaders podcast. I'm Andrea Johnson, the Intentional Optimist. And today I have with me somebody that I really love talking to. Welcome, Marianne Snow.
It's so fun to be here. Thanks, Andrea.
Oh, I'm so thrilled. Marianne, if you have not listened to my podcast this week, Marianne is my guest. And the title of that podcast episode is You Had Me at Remote. And when I said that in our podcast interview, she started laughing. And my producer said, "There's no way we can't actually title the show You Had Me at Remote because every time you said it, she laughed." And it's a good thing. But Mary Ann is a remote work distributed team leadership expert with 20 plus years of experience. She helps organizations operationalize their work processes, maximizing productivity within remote and distributed teams. I mean, this is something that is very relevant for today. And before we really get started on some of that, I have to tell you, lately, I am seeing some haters out there.
Of course, there's always been haters. There will always be haters. And I would argue that some of that is coming from the fact that how do you establish your authority, or how do you really manage in environments where you have a preference for having visual line of sight?
Oh,
And
yeah.
so, to a certain extent, anytime that you ask people to change, right? Anytime that you ask people to consider something differently, adopt a new perspective, change the way they do stuff, there are going to be winners and losers. And so, I would argue that in the conversations that you and I are having right now, a lot of the folks who are most concerned are individuals who gain their success through old models and are looking to return.
And I think that's key, return,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And this happened after, it happens after every crisis. It happened after the financial service meltdown. It happened after the tech bubble. I mean, we could go back and we can look at all the inflection points, right?
Okay.
Pre cell phone, pre digital media, pre
Sure.
social media, pre live streaming. It's happened every single time that there's been some sort of a monumental change. And the problem is that the world is different now,
Yeah.
and
Well,
people
and
hate change.
yeah, and the most recent exchange that I witnessed, because it's I was telling my friend the other day, it's so funny the things we don't know that we don't know until we're confronted with them and we go, "Oh, I didn't know that." um, well, and it wasn't even that I didn't know it. It was just that it just never occurred to me because I love the idea of working remote. I love the idea that nobody's looking over my shoulder because I work better that way. I can type over 90 words a minute. But if you watch me, it's like boop, 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 boop. Because it's like mistake after mistake after mistake. And it's that feeling of being watched that I never flourished under. And so for me, the idea of being remote and being able to truly produce well and produce at my own speed and my own timeline always just was like, so my family kind of leaned into the whole COVID hermitude. That's what I was going to say. I just put those words together. The whole hermit aspect of COVID, because we all did really well. My son did really well remote, and his teachers did really well. And what I've seen lately is the mental health aspect of everybody being remote. And the argument was one size does not fit all. You can't say remote is good. And I'm like, I didn't jump in the fray because I didn't feel like I needed to. But my response was, well, precisely, one size does not fit all. So you
Yeah,
can't say we can't say remote.
yeah. And ironically, as somebody who has been working in distributed teams, and I think it's really important when we're thinking about, what does remote mean? There's a lot of different permutations, and quite frankly, there's been a lot of permutations for a long time. If you're working in a globalized organization, if you work in a company that has multiple locations, and let's talk about something that is really, really traditional. How about banking?
Mm,
Retail banking, right? and you've got a home office, some sort of a home office that has administrative group that may be doing the organization's finances. They could be reporting. They could be, the HR function. They could be the executive team, and yet they have lots and lots of branches. That was a distributed team.
Yeah.
People were not sitting together in the same space. And so remote means lots of different things. If you're a national organization and you're not all sharing the same office space, maybe you're all going to an office, but you're a distributed team. You're going to have to adopt remote work practices, because if you want to connect with people, quite frankly, it's just not practical or cost effective to get on a plane and do it remotely. And before the pandemic, people were doing it via audio conference calls, which were painful, and most people did it terribly. And
With
the
those
majority
big
of
things in the middle of the
humans,
table.
right, and the majority of humans were multitasking and not paying attention and kind of checking the box. And
Yeah.
so if somebody I think it's important, and I just had this conversation with a young professional who reached out to me just the other day, and she's she's challenged because she's got some anxiety, you know, that really surfaced particularly during COVID. And one of the things I said to her is, I said, you can't use remote work as a solution for reducing anxiety. You have to actually address the mental health issues that are getting you there. However, remote work is neither the solution, nor is it going to make it worse for you. If you're just using it as a method for working efficiently. If you're using it as a method for hiding out because going to your office makes you anxious, then that's a whole nother issue that you have to deal with separately.
Yeah.
So separate mental health from the construct of working effectively when your team just doesn't sit in the same physical location, and separate, you know, um, performance.
Mm.
Because if people are performing, it does being co-located and having line of sight necessarily dictate that they're going to be productive? And as long as they're meeting their obligations, why does it matter?
Yeah. Well, and I think some of that goes back to, what does productive mean?
Mhm.
How are you measuring it?
Right.
Are you really measuring it? And as a manager, for 23 years in corporate, as I left corporate nearly a year ago in 2 days, it's not an important day or
Congratulations.
anything. But part of what I struggled with was, I really wanted to use the performance management system that we had, but so many people just saw it as, well, this is my job description and this is how I'm doing it. So, but part of that is overall part of the culture. And there's a culture in every organization. There's a culture in co-located organizations, and there's a culture in remote organizations. And my understanding is that today you're going to give us some pointers and some tips on working on the culture in these, because I think that's something that, if we can't have good culture when we're all in the same space, how do we have good culture when we're not all in the same space?
Well, ironically, anything that I talk about today is specific to remote culture and distributed team culture, just because of the construct. I mean, part of it is we're actually standardizing the definition for those type of work environments, so that people are consciously understanding when those constraints exist, even if they happen to have some sort of a brick and mortar office culture. But I think it's also important to put it in the context of anything that we talk about is applicable to an office culture in general. But
Okay.
it is quite specific to a remote or a distributed culture, because if you don't take conscious steps to engage people, to set people up for success, and to have an operating model that allows you to be able to assess performance, then it's easy to assume that it's the remote work that's at fault. And
Because that's
That's
the
not the
anomaly.
case.
Right.
It's
Right.
just not the case.
That's the piece of the equation that changed. So let's you've got some stuff to share with us. Let's go ahead and let you kind of give us school us just a little bit here on how we can create a positive culture.
So I think it's important, and what I'm going to do is I just want to set a context and talk about methodologies, and then get people to start rethinking operational structure, because I want us to reflect on the last 2.5 years. And I had the conversation the other day with folks who very rightly are saying, does every job have to be remote? Of course, it doesn't have to be remote. There's no one size fits all. It goes to what we were talking about earlier, Andrea, which is, you know, um, people have to make their own choices about what business model is appropriate. But what I do think is important for us to know is that for the past 2.5 years, throughout a global pandemic, people found ways to keep things running, to maintain contact,
Yep.
to lead remote and distributed teams, to adapt to business demands, and also to onboard new team members. And in many
We did it.
cases, to do that without face to face interactions.
That's resilience. No matter what anybody says, when we adapt to things like that, that shows the beauty and the resilience of the human condition, is it not?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah,
And the other thing is, quite frankly, it was a proof of concept for a lot of folks.
I'll bet.
So think about it. Think about what message you're sending to your group if for the last 2.5 years you asked them to operate in this circumstance without any social support, because going to the grocery store was hard. People were homeschooling kids. They were adapting without childcare, multiple
Mhm.
people in the space. And now you're telling them that they can't be productive unless they recommence a commute at gas prices that are unprecedentedly high. And quite frankly, people are feeling disrespected, and they're feeling a little insulted because they're sitting
Oh,
there going, what did you think we did for the last couple of years?
well, and that's one, like I said, in 2 days, it'll be a year since my last day in corporate, and one of the things as a manager that I really struggled with was having staff members who had children. Entire, um, childcare systems had shut down,
Yeah,
right? So, with the type of work that they were able to do, they could do it overnight, right? It didn't have to be, as long as it got done, it didn't really matter, but
right.
because it wasn't what, you know yeah. Anyway, you've already said that. I don't
Yeah,
wanna harp too much, but
but
you're right.
one of
They
the
were very
things
insulted.
but one of the things that was kind of interesting was I had a conversation over the weekend with a very dear friend of mine who said, "Are we creating this bifurcated system where some people can work remotely and some people can't?" And I sort of chuckled because I'm like, "We've always had a bifurcated system." In a service industry, you have people who are customer facings and folks who aren't. If you're in healthcare, and you're in an emergency department, you have to work 24/7 and you don't get holidays off. And yet there were people in that healthcare system who could work a 9 to 5 schedule because they had more flexibility. So I don't think that this is a new construct, but I think what's happening is we have to rethink the models, and we have to acknowledge that technology advances and some of the things that are happening are just going to drive people's interest in having more flexibility, whatever that means.
Mhm,
And just because a C suite group has skepticism about that and many managers want to go back to the office, I think we need to examine why that is. What are you actually hoping to accomplish?
mhm,
Because we've had distributed or hybrid teams forever. And
mhm,
what it really kind of comes down to is when we're creating that standard definition, there have been organizations that have been separated by distance always. And now the technology is catching up. So these teams are dependent on technology, they're dependent on the internet, but at their fundamental level, they're staffed by people. So you're
yeah.
still going to have to manage, lead people. And that's always been the hardest part. quite frankly,
But it's
you
so
know?
much easier when you can manage by walking around.
Well, sort of, and easier for whom? Is it easier for your
You can
people?
catch them playing solitaire, honey. You can make sure they're not on Instagram.
So, my contention is, communication and engagement in any sort of productive work environment. It's easier when you have a goal in mind, when
Yeah,
there's, a shared purpose, and where there's good flow of communication, and when there's trust, right? Benefit of the doubt perspective. If you have me in an office, but you assume bad intent, I don't care if I'm in
yeah.
an office
Mhm.
or I'm out of an office, then we're not going to have trust, and that's a problem. But one of the things that is interesting is no matter what, even in an office, people are too dependent on technology, and emails or whatever, online to offline, is now becoming really kind of the watchword of the day, because let's talk about the reality of an employee's interaction today.
Okay.
you
This is
know
this
um
is a pretty slide. What does it say?
if I'm working in a company, it would not be unusual for me to have a project meeting kick off as a fully virtual or a fully, conference call event.
Okay.
And, there are people doing brainstorming sessions. I'm actually working with a team that includes, we're working with a team that's going to put some stuff on the International Space Station. So, I'm working with a group of people who are all over the place. It's not cost effective for us to get together in one
Right.
space every single time. We brainstorm in that space and we're online. We
Mm.
do email recaps. We then do video stuff, sometimes one on one and sometimes as a group. At a certain point in time, we're all going to be in the same room when that rocket ship goes off. And yet, we're going to have a crew on the rocket ship going to the space station, and we're going to have to interact through some sort of electronics.
I don't know how that doesn't validate your I mean, that's proof of concept right there. I mean
And that's
I mean,
obviously
we trust spam and Tang, right? I mean, it's like, why can't we trust remote work for the space station?
well, look at how much video has changed things. I mean,
Yeah,
audio, when we were just doing audio, and I started using video back when Skype was the only option, and I
right.
was doing a lot of stuff internationally. And the thing that always struck me was, the body language, right? It puts people back in the room where you have people talking to people. And I worked with folks who had an interesting mentality, just a friend you haven't met yet.
Yes.
And so we gave each other the benefit of the doubt, trust but verify. And I think that this is really important, because when you're thinking about productivity, and that people have said to me, how do I know people are working? And I said, well, how do you know someone's working in an office? You have measurements.
Ding, ding.
You have goals. You
Yeah.
come up with competency models. You have job expectations, and you have deliverables, some sort of key performance indicators. And you also have to set up interpersonal interaction norms, because what's okay and what's not okay in terms of behaviors. And it requires a leader to take a different role,
Mm.
where instead of actually being the person who catches people doing stuff wrong, you have to enable your team to do stuff right,
Yes.
which means you got to communicate those expectations up front and then prep people, train them, mentor them, coach them, provide the resources. And then, what a concept, observe performance against those expectations, against the baseline you established, and let them
Shocking.
know when they're making it
And when they're
and
not.
when there need to be redirected.
I
And
had the exact conversation in my family, right?
yeah.
Because we have 8th grade orientation today.
Mm,
So I have a nearly 14-year-old in my house. And it is a 13, 14-year-old boy's job to learn the boundaries, to push the boundaries, to establish their own identity.
Yep.
That is an adolescent young teenager's job. If they're not doing that, I'm a little concerned. And the problem is when we don't have expectations that are written down, that are the boundary lines that are clearly drawn, or if they continually get moved. I don't have a problem with saying no, right? I have a husband who is just much more malleable, just it's like that's one of the reasons why we work well together. Because I'm like that. And then there are other ways where he is very structured, but we had this conversation. If we know what the expectations are, we write them down, we put them where everybody can see them, and everybody agrees those are the expectations. When the expectations are not met, it's just really clear. Nobody has to get emotional about it.
Yeah.
Nobody has to be, there doesn't need to be any shaming done. It's just we all know what we're working toward and measuring up against. And I found this was 100% applicable at home and at work.
Yep.
And one of the things that, we talked about in my corporate work was that they weren't available for communication. And I had this conversation with a client this week, and part of it was helping because she literally had somebody calling her and saying, "I'm calling you several times a day just to see if you answer the phone." and, and how do you answer when they say that? And she said, because they said, "What are you doing all day?" Because they moved her office, are you ready for this? Across the parking lot into another building.
Yeah.
That's all. And so I said, "How do you answer?" And she said, "Well, I feel like I want to give them a list of the things I'm doing." And I said, "You don't have to answer any of that. They're not your supervisor. They just kind of want to know what you're doing. All you need to say is, how can I help you? And how can I help you best be in touch with me?"
Yep.
And she said, "Because I want to help." And I'm like, "Well, of course you do. You're a good, solid staff member that cares about the organization and how things run and what things are going to get done, and the expectations for you. They don't know the expectations, right?" So it's a little bit of communicating in this whole cycle. I love that the leader's at the center of this hub.
Yeah.
Just love that visual
Yeah.
is very powerful.
I think the other thing too that's important in this is now this is also a system that requires people to live up to their full responsibilities. And if the leader is the center, then appreciate that part of what they're doing is they're enabling, they're supporting, but they're also requiring other people to hold up their end of the bargain.
Yeah.
Which means, if you and I are going to work together and you set expectations for me, then part of it is I also have to let you know what my expectations are. And that means the two of us
Mm-hmm.
are going to own those responsibilities, own those expectations, and hold each other accountable. So now, to your point, feedback is less emotional.
Yeah.
And not only is it less emotional, Andrea, it's normalized.
Yeah.
So we're going to have an ongoing dialogue. It's
Yeah.
not just episodic. It
Yeah.
is an ongoing dialogue that feeds into, by the way, the corporate world's worst nightmare, which is performance appraisals. Which have a tendency to be delivered kind of out of context and usually just mostly create a lot of animosity
Yeah.
because people feel like they're a disconnect from their actual performance,
And if
whereas the
yeah.
accountability cycle actually
Yeah.
feeds it. So now we're just gonna do a summary of all the conversations we've had.
Yeah, and that's what I used to tell my staff is you will not be surprised by a performance evaluation with me. You will get it throughout the year, and then you will not be surprised.
Yeah.
And so that's what I kind of teach people to do. And it's just a matter of, oh, this is normal and it's okay and it's good. And it's a collaborative effort rather than a directed effort.
Yep. 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 I think it's important too that you're thinking about, how do you integrate someone into this system? And, this is really important when you're talking about distributed teams or remote teams, because appreciate that the 30, 60, 90-day cycle is when people are making choices about whether they like the job or not, but they're also building fundamental skills and they're learning a lot about your culture. And so one of the things that that we're saying is, look at your whole talent management cycle and really kind of think about what it is that you're teaching people, not just from a functional point of view, but about team engagement, about expectations, about what their full responsibility is, but also what they can expect from you. So, that 30, 60, 90-day cycle is really important. But, reevaluating the whole performance review process. If you're setting expectations, to your point, there are no surprises, because if you're observing against those metrics and providing feedback and you're keeping good records, the review writes itself.
Yeah. Well, and if you're having conversations, then they know what's in the records.
Yeah.
Right? And if you're catching them doing the right things and you're reinforcing that and you're making sure that they understand what the expectations are, then they're going to live up to them.
Yeah.
Or they're going to provide their own solution.
Yeah. And in which case it's like, okay, but performance accountability in this circumstance, you can also come up with the protocols, because here's the conversation. And I literally just had this conversation with someone just this morning where, in this cycle, if a person chooses to not meet the expectations, now, if they're not meeting them because they haven't been given the resources or the training, that's one thing.
Yeah.
But if you've done your due diligence and people are choosing to behave against, then they're making a choice. So we literally have had conversations with folks where we've said, here's the consequence. And if we have this conversation with you again, then you're choosing not to work here.
Right.
And when you sit down with them for a final conversation and you're saying to them, this is, what do you think we're going to talk about today? I actually had someone saying, you're going to tell me that I don't work here anymore. And I'm going to say, well, there's nothing more to say.
Yeah.
And that's a big difference.
All right, then.
But this allows you to be able to create meaningful career paths because, but, if you're talking about remote or distributed, I can tell you from firsthand experience that most organizations discount their remote or distributed team members because they're not in the direct line of sight, which means there's a huge talent pool in your organization that you're not considering, that you are actually underutilizing because they just don't happen to be physically present and you can't visually see them all the time. And it's the companies who are thinking about their teams holistically that are going to win. But none of this can happen without the trust, and trust doesn't exist in these environments without that dynamic information flow. And that means talking, but that means listening, and it means kind of a constant thing. So that's really what it boils down to. It is really not rocket science, and yet
but they're using it.
But you can use it when you're applying rocket science.
I literally the solo episode before yours was about trusting yourself from me.
Yeah.
And there's yours, and then there's all, and like just sparked it all up. And so the one coming out next week is all about building trust and respect in your teams. And here you are talking about the trust cycle. And I just find that is so, we are in such a high deficit of that right now.
Yep.
And I think there's many, many reasons, and it's not just COVID, and it's not just, there's just so many things, but the bottom line is it has to start with you.
Yeah.
It just does. And you are the one that makes that choice to trust. You are the one that makes that choice to give the trust, or to hold up your end of the bargain, or to like offer a different option in a meeting. And you're the one that can do that. So this has been very much from the perspective of teams, very much from the organizational perspective. And I know that when we spoke on our podcast, you said you've got a list of organizations and businesses that are looking for people who will thrive in these kinds of environments. And they run off these systems that you probably have just explained to us because you've been working with them.
Yeah.
So I'm going to put, for sure, for companies that want to look at how to do this for their teams and to tap into that talent pool that they've not been paying attention to actually utilize I loved your word, holistic staff that they have. They go to remotenationworks.org.
Yeah, we
Okay.
have the Remote Nation Institute that's standardizing business practices and leadership and management practices. And we also have our business to business B2B consulting company, Sophaya, that helps people operationalize the productivity in distributed and remote teams. Lots of different permutations here, folks. We're not just talking about working from home, although everything's on the table these days
I know.
because technology wise and cost effectively, everything's on the table. And hate to tell you, but the labor market is going to be the driver in a lot of this. So, like it or not, it's going to happen soon.
Yeah. So if perhaps there's somebody watching who says, I want to work for one of those companies, the best way to contact you is to either connect with you on LinkedIn, or can they go to remotenationworks.org and find you?
They can absolutely come to Remote Nation to find me, and they can also find me through LinkedIn.
Excellent. Well, if you go to my podcast, The Intentional Optimist, Unconventional Leaders Podcast, episode 98, that's Marianne Snow's. You had me at remote because that was when, as soon as you said remote, I'm like, I want the conversation. And you will hear a delightful conversation between me and Marianne, and you will learn a whole lot more about her past and how she came to be the expert in this. She started out with VHS tapes, y'all. That's just going to say it. So it has been a delight to chat with you today. Please, if you are someone who is interested in getting one of these jobs with one of these organizations that has this new paradigm of thinking or is willing to go in this direction, please reach out and contact her. She will take care of you. She will plug you in or she will put you in touch with someone. But for today, we are going to sign off and say thank you so much. And please, let's stay in touch and definitely hang in there with whatever you've got going with the space station. I can't wait to see it.
Well, thanks so much. I appreciate it. And I might be frozen on the screen, but
You
I'm
are. We can
still
hear you.
animated. I'm still animated in my chair.
We can hear you. All right, have a great day. See y'all later.
Thanks.